All right, so this is the last slide in this lecture on measuring GDP and growth. And it is about growth, so we haven't talked much about economic growth yet. But we distinguish between long-run and short-run economic growth. And it can be illustrated with the concept of a production possibility frontier. We have already seen production possibility frontiers when we talked about specialization and trade, and as opposed to those that you see here, the PPF, which are concave or bowed outwards, then we had, like in the trade section for simplicity, we just assumed something, a PPF like this. So we assume that a country can produce either guns or butter. And by the way, the historical reason why you often see the metaphor of guns and butter in the context of production possibility frontiers has historical reasons. When the United States decided, I don't remember if it was World War I or World War II, probably World War I, that Congress has now control over fertilizers during the war, then the newspapers the next day, they were writing about, now we have to face a trade-off between using fertilizers in order to grow more grass, which then more cows will eat, and which then will give more milk and then produce more butter, or we have to use fertilizer in order for the production of guns. A fertilizer eventually is highly explosive, can be used for both. Can fertilize soil or be used as an explosive. So, but anyhow, the reason why those PPFs that you see here have like this outward bowed shape has to do with the incorporation of the law of diminishing marginal output. But we could do the same thing with just a linear one. But of course this is more realistic, but we can just assume, it is straight. Well, let's assume we are currently in B, and if we manage economic growth so that we can move from point B to point D, then we shift on another production possibility frontier. So that is what we associate with long-run growth. Long-run growth means shifting the PPF outward. Okay, so this is what we call long-run growth. But if we have, let's say, a situation where we move from, let's say, point B to point A, or from point D to point C, that is a short-run economic crisis. And that is very similar to what happened in the 1920s after the stock market crash. So what happened in 1929 at the stock market crash, let's say in 1928, the economy was still producing at point B. Everyone, all resources were utilized. There was no unemployment, and all the machines were turned on and running at an optimum level. But then came the stock market crash, and suddenly a lot of people were unemployed. Nobody had any income anymore. A lot of people lost their savings in the banks. Nobody could buy anything anymore, and we were pushed from point B to point A. So now this is what we call the short-run economic shock, because the economy is still possible theoretically to produce, let's say, on point B or on the year one PPF, but because of a structural crisis or an exogenous shock, we were pushed temporarily into point A, to point A. So now if we want to reverse that one again, then, like if we move from point A to point B, well, that is what we would call short-run growth. So we have to basically jumpstart the economy again so that we can utilize all available resources. So short-run growth can be thought of as moving from inside the PPF to the PPF again. And we have very different tools and explanatory factors for short run versus long run growth. So in the short run, that is basically Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics is also known as stabilization policy. So stabilization policy was designed in order to push the economy from inside a point, from inside the PPF, from a point inside the PPF back on the PPF. And that can be done with either fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, that is basically, in very simple terms, the government spends itself out of trouble. So think again of the 1929 stock market crash. A lot of people were unemployed, and the factories, they had lots of machines that weren't running, and people were too poor to buy anything, or they lost their job. So now the idea of fiscal policy is that the government steps in, and the government starts building like public goods, like public universities, highways, bridges, national parks, and those kind of things. So the government becomes a massive employer. Then the workers, they get income, and then they get that income in order to buy again a new refrigerator, a new radio, maybe a new car, new furniture for their home. And so fiscal policy can be used to stabilize the economy. Well, there's also monetary policy. And Keynes, who is the father of modern macroeconomics, especially in the context of the stock market crash of 1929, advocated against monetary policy. And he said, well, if you use monetary policy, that will lead to a liquidity trap. So the idea of monetary policy is that the central bank makes money really cheap, so the interest rate is very low, and then the firms, they would use that inexpensive access to fresh capital in order to build your factories or acquire new capital and machines. But in the context of the stock market crash, the owners of capital, the producers, the entrepreneurs or the firms, their problem was not that they needed to buy more machines because they had plenty of machines that were not running. Their problem was that they needed to produce against something with the machines that they already had. So that is why monetary policy would have been a liquidity trap. Nobody would have gotten a loan in order to build new factories because the concern was in 1929, after the stock market crash, how can we utilize again the existing capital that we already have? So that raises the question, when is fiscal policy better than monetary policy? And as a general rule, whenever we have a shock that leads to a reduction of aggregate demand, like a lot of people were laid off, as a result of the banking crisis of 1929 and the stock market crash, and they didn't have any income, so demand collapsed. So first demand collapsed, but there was plenty of capital that could produce much more and serve many more people. So whenever we have excess capital as a result of a shock, fiscal policy is pretty effective. Well, monetary policy is more effective if we have, for example, a natural catastrophe like an earthquake, and that reduces a lot of capital. But we know that the economy could support, a much higher output than after the earthquake or a tsunami or a war. So therefore, in order to encourage that the scarce capital stock is being rebuilt quickly again, then monetary policy is very effective. So monetary policy is typically used whenever the crisis corresponds to a capital shortage. And that is what you often have as a result of a natural catastrophe. There's a temporary catastrophe that destroyed some capital. We know that in the long run we can produce much more because we have all the people. But so now what we need to do is we need to encourage again more investment, more capital formation, and then monetary policy through lower interest rates could be very effective. What about long-run growth? So long-run growth is determined by things like population growth. It is also determined by things like overall productivity, the technology that we use. It is also determined by institutions like good governance, high quality government, the absence of corruption, and those kind of things. So those things like total increases in technology, factor productivity, population growth, capital accumulation, those are all determinants of long-run growth. They shift the PPF to the right. So the PPF, the production possibility frontier, is shifted to the right. That's long-run growth. But as we move back from inside the PPF back to a point on the PPF, that is the short run. Okay, so that concludes this chapter on measuring GDP, and we talked a little bit about growth. And of course that just gives you an initial idea, because especially growth theory, that's really interesting. It's at least something that I like a lot. And there's a lot of things that can be done. But as far as we're concerned now, we are done with this chapter. And in the next videos, we begin with reviewing some of the concepts by looking at the problem set.